My name is Sarah Malik. I am 36 years old. And the afternoon I discovered my parents had transferred the business to my younger sister, I did not raise my voice. I did not slam a single door. I did not even ask why. I just stood in my father's office, holding a manila envelope that had been left open on his desk, reading the same line again and again until the words stopped looking like words and started looking like a verdict. The business was called Malik Home Textiles. My grandfather had started it from a single rented stall in the old market, selling bedsheets and curtain fabric by the yard. By the time my father took over, it had grown into a proper wholesale company. 3 warehouses, 24 staff, contracts with retail chains across 4 cities. And by the time I joined at 22, fresh out of a business degree and full of plans nobody asked for, it was surviving. Just barely. I was the one who changed that. I spent the first year reorganizing the accounts because nobody had been tracking margins properly. I spent the second year renegotiating supplier contracts because we were overpaying on raw imports by nearly 30%. I brought in the retail partnerships. I redesigned the packaging. I built the export side from scratch, cold emailing buyers in the Gulf until someone finally responded. For 11 years, I gave that company every good idea I had. My sister Hira was 7 years younger than me. She was kind and soft-spoken and had never once expressed any interest in the business. She had studied fine arts. She painted watercolors in her bedroom on weekends. She was lovely, and I had never once blamed her for being the daughter my mother found easier to love. That afternoon, I had stopped by my father's office to drop off a signed vendor contract. He was not there. His desk was messy the way it always was, stacks of paper and old catalogs and 2 cups of cold tea. The envelope was sitting on top of everything, unsealed, the top flap folded back like someone had been reading it recently and simply set it down. I should not have looked. But the company name was printed on the cover sheet and my own name was not on it anywhere, and something in my chest went cold before my brain had time to explain why. So I looked. Ownership transfer. Hira Malik. Effective immediately upon signing. Witnessed and notarized. The date on the document was 3 weeks earlier. For 3 weeks I had been coming to work every morning, managing staff, approving purchase orders, reviewing shipment schedules, sitting in meetings with buyers, and sending my father progress reports on the export quarter. For 3 weeks, none of it had been mine. I put the envelope back exactly as I found it. I straightened the corner so it matched the edge of the paper underneath it. I picked up my bag. I walked past the front desk and told our receptionist I was heading out early for supplier call. She smiled and said, "Of course, Sarah Baji." I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting the engine. I want to tell you that I cried. It would make this part of the story easier to understand. But I did not cry. I felt something quieter than sadness and more permanent than anger. I felt like a person who had just seen proof of something they had been trying not to believe for a very long time. Before I tell you what I did next, I need to ask you something. If you open a document today and discovered that 11 years of your work had been quietly handed to someone else, what would your first move be? Drop it in the comments. Because mine is going to surprise you. I did not go home and make a dramatic plan. I went home, changed out of my work clothes, and made myself a cup of tea. Then I sat at my kitchen table and opened a blank spreadsheet. I am not someone who processes things out loud. I process in columns and rows. I find clarity in numbers because numbers do not argue with you, and they do not change their story, depending on who is in the room. I started with the year I joined. I typed the date. Then I began listing what I remembered. Every initiative, every contract I had personally negotiated, every client I had brought in. I did not guess. I pulled from my own saved files, my old emails, the records I had been keeping out of habit since the beginning because I had always believed that clean documentation was the sign of a professional. It took me 4 hours. When I was finished, I looked at the total revenue generated from work I had directly led. I looked at the export division numbers alone. I looked at the year before I joined versus the year we hit our highest profit margin. I looked at the staff I had hired, trained, and in 2 cases, let go when it was necessary, and my father had not wanted to have the conversation. Then I opened a second tab and wrote 2 words at the top. My terms. I was not going to scream. I was not going to send a long emotional message that my mother could forward to relatives as evidence that I was unstable. I was not going to walk into that office the next morning pretending nothing had changed, because everything had changed, and I had spent 11 years pretending things were fine when they were not. What I was going to do was stop. Not dramatically. Not with a speech. I was simply going to step back from every responsibility I had been carrying as if it were mine, because it was no longer mine. And I was going to do it quietly, methodically, and completely. That night, I sent a short message to my father. No anger in it. No accusations. Just 5 sentences. I told him I had seen the ownership document on his desk. I told him I respected that it was his decision to make. I told him I would need 2 weeks to brief Hira on all active accounts and ongoing operations. I told him that after those 2 weeks I would be stepping back from my role. And I told him I hoped we could speak properly when he was ready. He read it at 11:47 p.m. I know because the 2 blue ticks appeared while I was still awake, staring at the ceiling. He did not reply that night. My mother called at 7:15 the next morning. I let it ring, not because I was punishing her, because I knew exactly what she would say, and I knew that if I heard her voice before I had finished deciding who I was going to be in this situation, she would pull me back into the version of myself that always found a way to understand. I had been understanding for 11 years. I drove to the office. I greeted the staff the way I always did. I sat at my desk. I opened the handover document I had started building the night before, quietly, without telling anyone what it was. And while everyone around me assumed it was another ordinary Tuesday, I began the careful, invisible work of removing myself from a company I had spent over a decade building. Nobody noticed. That was the part that confirmed everything. When you are the person holding something together, you become invisible inside it. People do not see the effort. They only feel the stability. And stability, everyone agrees, is simply the way things are supposed to be. On the 3rd day, my father came to find me. He stood in the doorway of my office with his hands in his pockets, looking older than I remembered, and said, "Sarah, we should talk." I looked up from my screen. I said, "I know. When you are ready, I am here." He nodded slowly and left without saying anything else. I closed my office door and sat quietly for a moment, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like I was finally being honest, not with my family but with myself, about what I had accepted, about how long I had confused love with availability, about the difference between choosing to give and being quietly assumed into giving, so gradually that the line disappeared, and you forgot it was ever there. I had spent 11 years being the most dependable person in that building. And dependability, I was learning, had a shadow side. The more dependable you are, the easier it becomes for people to depend on you without ever asking whether the wait is fair. I was not angry at Hira. She had not asked for this. She did not know what it would cost. I was not even fully angry at my parents. I understood, in the way you understand something painful and true, that they had made a decision rooted in their own fears. They worried about Hira. They trusted that I would be fine. And they were right that I would be fine. They were just wrong. I want to ask you something before we get to what happened when the handover was complete. Have you ever been the dependable one in your family, the person everyone leans on but nobody thinks to protect? Tell me in the comments. Because what comes next in this story is about exactly what happens when the dependable one finally stops, about what fine was going to look like from here. She had no idea the warm cup pressed into her hands every single night was slowly stopping her heart. She thought it was love. She thought her husband of 4 years, the man who had walked into her coffee shop one rainy Portland afternoon and told her that her smile looked like the first sunny day after a long gray winter, was taking care of her. Every evening, without fail, he would brew her a mug of lemon ginger tea, press a kiss to her forehead, and tell her he just wanted his wife to feel better. For 6 months, she drank every drop. For 6 months, she got sicker and sicker and had no idea why. Her name is Elena Marsh, formerly Elena Whitfield, and 6 weeks before her entire world collapsed, she was nobody remarkable by the world's accounting. an orphan raised in the foster system outside Eugene, Oregon. A community college girl who had scraped together a scholarship, earned an art education degree from a state university, and built a quiet life teaching third graders how to hold a paintbrush. She married Marcus Calloway at 27. He was charming the way men who study charm always are, deliberate, patient, and precise. He had looked at her across that coffee shop counter, like she was the only person in the room. Nobody had ever done that before. She believed him completely, and why wouldn't she? She had no family to warn her, no history to make her cautious, nothing but her own instincts, and her instincts said this man loved her. The chest pain started 6 months before everything fell apart. A deep, stumbling ache. Fatigue, so heavy she could barely grade papers by evening. Nausea in the mornings. A heartbeat that skipped like a scratched record. Marcus told her it was anxiety. Told her she was overworking, drinking too much coffee, carrying too much stress. He said it so gently, so consistently, that she believed that too. And every night, right on schedule, he handed her the tea. Warm mug, both hands, lemon and ginger, and something underneath it she could never quite name. She just assumed it was the honey. She was 31 years old when she woke up in the cardiac ICU with a fresh surgical scar running down the center of her chest and a machine counting the seconds of a life she no longer recognized. The surgery had been emergency open heart. The doctors told her that another few weeks and the damage would have been irreversible. She had survived by a margin so thin it didn't bear thinking about. And when she finally came back to consciousness, alone in that sterile cold room, the first person she saw was not her husband. It was a nurse in pale blue scrubs standing at the foot of her bed, clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield, eyes refusing to meet hers. The nurse told her quietly, the way people speak at funerals, that her insurance had been denied, that the primary policyholder had canceled coverage 48 hours ago, that unless the hospital received payment or a valid replacement policy by end of day tomorrow, Elena would be transferred to county care for the remainder of her recovery. Elena stared at her. The machines beeped in their small mechanical rhythm. She could smell the antiseptic, the faint copper of dried blood on her foreline, and something else beneath it all, the unmistakable smell of a decision that had already been made without her. She said there had to be a mistake. She said Marcus had signed the consent forms. He was her emergency contact. He had gone to the bank to arrange a loan. He would never. The nurse's jaw tightened. She told Elena she had been a nurse for 22 years. She told her the billing office had called the number on file 11 times in 2 days. Once, a woman had answered. The woman had said Elena was no longer Mr. Calloway's concern. A woman. Those 2 words landed somewhere beneath Elena's ribs, in the exact spot the surgeon had just finished repairing. She closed her eyes. Behind her lids, she saw the last 6 months in fast forward. Marcus working late. Marcus's phone always placed face down at dinner. Marcus telling her the chest pains were probably just stress. Marcus handing her that warm mug every single night, telling her he just wanted his wife to feel better. She opened her eyes. She asked the nurse one question. What did the doctor say caused this? The nurse hesitated and said Dr. Reyes would be in shortly, that the toxicology panel had come back that morning, and that Elena should please rest and not strain herself. Then she left, and for a long time the only sound in the room was the quiet accusation of Elena's own heart beating in a rhythm it had not chosen. The stranger arrived at exactly 3:47 that afternoon. Elena remembers the time because she had been watching the clock on the wall, trying not to cry, trying to calculate whether her personal credit card could cover even one more night of care, trying to imagine what her life looked like now, a woman with a mended heart and nowhere to go. He knocked twice on the open door frame. A courtesy she hadn't expected. He was tall, perhaps 60, with silver hair combed neatly back and the kind of stillness in his face that belongs to people who've spent their entire lives not flinching. Behind him stood a younger woman in a charcoal blazer, holding a leather portfolio. He said her name, and his voice caught on it in a way Elena didn't understand yet. He introduced himself as Richard Holt, an attorney from Boston, and said that he had been looking for her for 29 years. Elena would have laughed if she'd had the strength. She told him he had the wrong room. He told her he didn't. He crossed the tile floor with measured steps, stopped a respectful distance from the bed, and then he did something that took the air from her lungs entirely. He reached out very slowly and took her hand, the one without the four, and pressed it to his forehead. And she watched a tear fall from his eye onto the white sheet. "You look exactly like her," he whispered. "Exactly like your mother." The younger woman opened the leather portfolio. Inside, in a clear plastic sleeve, was a photograph. A woman with dark auburn hair and wide gray eyes, laughing into a camera. A small child sitting in her lap. The child had Elena's face. Richard's voice was steady and careful as he told her everything. Her birth name was Clara Ashford. Her mother was Margaret Ashford, the only daughter of a man named Edmund Ashford III. She had been taken from a car accident site in New Hampshire in the winter of 1997 when she was just 2 years old. The state had recorded her as a fatality. Her car seat had been found 20 feet from the wreckage, empty and covered in blood. A passing motorist had taken her to a hospital 3 counties away under a different name. She had entered the foster system as Jane Doe. She had become Elena Whitfield because that was the name written on the bracelet the emergency room had given her the night she was admitted. The room had begun to spin. She could feel her pulse in her throat. Her mother had died at the scene, Richard told her. Her father had spent every remaining year of his life searching for her and had died the previous spring, still believing she was alive. His will had left the Ashford family trust to be held in waiting until she was found, or until legal presumption of death was established. A DNA match from a discarded coffee cup outside her apartment had confirmed her identity 3 weeks ago. Elena whispered it back to him. 3 weeks ago, and he said yes, and his expression shifted in a way that made her stomach drop. She said that was when she had started feeling sick. A shadow passed behind his eyes, the kind that experienced attorneys have learned to hide very well. She understood in that moment that he already suspected what the doctor was about to walk in and tell her. Then Richard said, quietly and without drama, that the trust her grandfather had established was worth approximately $412 million, and that she was its sole heir. $412 million. Elena thought about the lemon ginger tea every night for 6 months, and something cold and clear and sharp as a surgical blade clicked into place inside her. Dr. Reyes was a small man with kind eyes, and he closed the door behind him before he sat down, which told Elena everything before he said a single word. He told her that the toxicology report had shown elevated levels of a compound called oleandrin in her bloodstream. It comes from the oleander plant. In small repeated doses, it causes fatigue, nausea, and irregular heartbeat. In larger doses administered over time, it damages the heart muscle itself. Given the pattern of damage the surgical team had found, his best medical estimate was that she had been ingesting it for 4 to 6 months. Elena stared at the ceiling. There was a water stain up there in the shape of a rabbit. She had been looking at it for a week, and she kept looking at it now. She asked if it could be dissolved in food. The doctor said it dissolved easily in warm liquid, tea, soup, broth, and that it had a slightly bitter taste that could be masked with honey or citrus. She nodded. She thought about honey. She thought about citrus. She thought about the man who had pressed that mug into her hands every single night and kissed her forehead and told her he just wanted his wife to feel better. She said, in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness, that she would like the police to come today, please, before she was discharged. Dr. Reyes glanced at Richard. Richard nodded once. The detective, the doctor told her gently, was already on the way. She turned her face to the window. Outside, Portland rain was falling soft and gray, the way it had fallen on her wedding day 4 years ago when Marcus had kissed her under a borrowed umbrella and told her she was the only family he would ever need. Let her be honest with you about what came next because the story deserves it. Recovery took 12 weeks, not 2. A chest that has been cracked open and sewn shut does not mend on a dramatic timeline. She spent the first 3 weeks learning to breathe without wincing. The next 4 learning to walk the length of a hospital corridor without her hands shaking. Cardiac rehab was 3 mornings a week after that, with a physical therapist named Diane who did not care that Elena was suddenly one of the wealthiest women in New England. She cared that Elena did her squats correctly and drank enough water. Richard moved her to a private rehabilitation facility in the hills above a quiet lake as soon as she was stable enough to be transferred, not because she asked, but because he knew Marcus did not know she was still alive. And that silence, it turned out, was the most valuable thing she had. Because while Elena lay healing, the picture of what Marcus had actually done was becoming terrifyingly clear. He had not simply abandoned her. He had gone home the night before her surgery, forwarded the hospital's calls to a burner phone, told the billing office his wife was no longer his responsibility, canceled the insurance policy, emptied their joint savings account of $84,000, and left Portland with a woman named Vanessa Cole, 34 years old, commercial real estate agent, who had been sleeping with Elena's husband for 19 months. Elena knows all of this because Richard's firm hired a private investigator the morning after their first conversation. Marcus had believed Elena was dead, or close enough to dead that the difference didn't matter. He had calculated it carefully. Cancel the insurance. Let the hospital transfer her to county care. A heart poison for 6 months does not recover easily under overworked residents in an underfunded ward. He had timed it to the day. What he had not calculated was the toxicology panel. He had not calculated the private cardiologist Richard flew in from Massachusetts General, who ordered every test including the one that named the weapon. And he had not calculated something else, something that, when Elena learned it, almost made her feel sorry for how stupid he had been. Her grandfather's will had been filed in probate court 3 weeks before her surgery, which meant that if Marcus had succeeded in making her disappear, he would have inherited absolutely nothing. Elena had never updated her will after marrying him. The Ashford Trust, by its original terms, would have reverted to a cousin in Connecticut. Marcus Calloway had been slowly poisoning his wife for 6 months for money that would never have reached his hands. He wasn't a mastermind. He was a small, vain, frightened man who had listened to too many true crime podcasts and believed himself clever. He had not done nearly enough reading. Elena spent her first week at the rehabilitation facility on a white porch swing with a thick wool blanket and a cup of plain hot water in her hands. She could not bring herself to drink tea yet. Richard sat beside her and read from a folder labeled with Marcus's name in black permanent marker. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she asked how long it would take to find Vanessa Cole's professional license, her mortgage records, her bank history, and her social media going back 3 years. Richard smiled for the first time since she had met him and said, "My dear, I already have them." What followed was the strangest education of her life. She learned that the Ashford Trust held stakes in 47 public companies, including, and she laughed out loud when Richard told her, a 41% controlling stake in Sentinel Coastal Insurance, the exact company that had canceled her coverage at Marcus's request. She learned that her grandfather had served on the board of Massachusetts General Hospital for over 2 decades, which was why a world-class cardiologist had appeared at her bedside within 18 hours of her being identified. She learned that her mother had painted watercolors, just as Elena had done her whole life without knowing why. And she learned, most importantly, that the small life she had built, the leaky apartment, the rusty Subaru, the third-grade classroom full of children who called her Miss E, had not been a small life at all. It had been a life built by a woman who did not know what she had been taken from, and who had loved it anyway. That was not nothing. That was the only part of the old life she decided to keep. Detective Morales of the Portland Police Department obtained a warrant for the house. In the back of the garage, inside an old coffee can, they found dried oleander leaves. Oleander does not grow wild in Oregon. Someone had ordered it online. Someone had paid for it on a credit card. One Marcus had opened in his own name 3 years ago to buy a used motorcycle and had apparently forgotten he still owned. The purchases had begun 7 months before Elena's cardiac event and continued at regular intervals until 8 days before her surgery. On the home laptop, which Marcus had not thought to wipe, detectives found a search history that any prosecutor would have called a road map to intent. Vanessa Cole had been more careful on her end. No oleander purchases in her name. But her text messages to Marcus, obtained after his arrest through a legal subpoena, contained enough references to the problem, and when it's done, and her family has money we haven't found yet to earn her a conspiracy charge all her own. They were arrested on a Thursday morning in April at a condo in Seattle, purchased by Marcus with a stolen savings money under his real name because he had genuinely believed no one was looking for him. Elena watched the arrest footage later. He looked small in the doorway. He looked confused. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who had never once in his life imagined that the woman he had decided to throw away might stand up, walk out, and come for him. The trial was set for October. But first, there was September. And September had a guest list. And one name on that guest list had no idea what was waiting for her in that room. There is a particular kind of power that belongs to a woman who has been underestimated her entire life and has finally stopped pretending she hasn't noticed. Elena Marsh stood in front of a mirror in the Ashford townhouse on Commonwealth Avenue on the evening of the September Gala and understood for the first time what that power felt like wearing a body. Her aunt had helped her choose the dress, dark green silk, high neckline, her chest scar invisible beneath it. Her hair was pinned up in the style of the portrait of her mother that hung in the upstairs hall. The dark auburn she had let grow back to its natural color after years of dyeing it blonde because Marcus had mentioned once, offhandedly and with a smile, that blondes looked warmer. She had thought of it as a preference. She understood now it had been control. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. Then she went downstairs, and she did not look back. The Ashford Foundation hosted an annual fundraiser at the Boston Public Library every September for pediatric cardiac research. It had been her grandfather's favorite cause, begun in the year after her mother's death. Her mother, who had been a pediatric nurse before she had Elena, who had spent her professional life making sure children's hearts kept beating. The foundation's board had been waiting to meet Elena for months. The press had been waiting longer. 400 people filled the marble halls that evening in their finest clothes, and Elena moved through them with Richard at her left and the full board of the foundation behind her, and she felt the eyes of the room track her the way eyes always track someone who has returned from somewhere most people don't come back from. She had asked Richard for one favor in the weeks leading up to the gala. She had asked him to personally invite the entire executive team of Sentinel Coastal Insurance, the company that held 41% of its shares in trust for her, the company that had canceled her insurance policy the day before her open-heart surgery. She told Richard she wanted to present them publicly with the commissioning of the new research wing in their name, in recognition of their long partnership with the Ashford family. Richard had not asked a single question. He had simply sent the invitations. The RSVP from Sentinel Coastal's office had come back within 48 hours, confirmed, full executive attendance, including their senior vice president of claims administration, a woman named Denise Cole. Denise Cole was Vanessa Cole's older sister. She had personally approved the emergency cancellation of Elena's insurance policy on the day before her surgery. Her signature was on the authorization form. Elena had obtained a certified copy of that form 2 months earlier and had read it so many times she could have recited it from memory. Denise Cole had sat at a desk in a downtown office building and signed her name to a document that was meant to ensure that a poisoned woman in a hospital bed would not survive long enough to become inconvenient. She had done it as a professional courtesy to her younger sister's boyfriend. She had done it without, apparently, a moment of hesitation. And she had walked into the Boston Public Library that September evening in a tailored blazer, a glass of champagne in her hand, with absolutely no idea that the new majority shareholder of her company was the woman she had tried to erase. Elena stood on the marble steps of the library and raised her glass and thanked every guest, moving through the room with the warmth and precision of someone who had spent years teaching children and knew exactly how to hold a crowd's attention. She thanked the Foundation's longtime supporters. She thanked the research teams at Massachusetts General. She spoke about her mother, Margaret Ashford, pediatric nurse, watercolor painter, a woman Elena never got to know but had somehow been becoming her whole life without realizing it. The room was very quiet. Then Elena thanked Sentinel Coastal Insurance specifically. She thanked them for 43 years of partnership with the Ashford family. She thanked Denise Cole by name and by title for her dedicated work in claims administration. She watched from across the room as Denise's smile went rigid. She watched the color drain from her face as the full weight of what was happening began to settle on her, slowly, like cold water rising. The woman at the podium knew her name. The woman at the podium knew her title. The woman at the podium was looking directly at her with the calm and steady eyes of someone who had been waiting for this moment for months. Elena announced that the Ashford Foundation would be commissioning a new pediatric cardiac wing at Massachusetts General Hospital. She announced that it would be named after her mother, Margaret Ashford. And then she announced that effective immediately, the Ashford Trust would be invoking its full shareholder rights to restructure Sentinel Coastal's executive claims division, that a press release would be issued in the morning, and that an independent ethics audit of the claims department would begin on Monday. She said it the way she had learned to say difficult things. Clearly, calmly, without apology, without theater. The room held its breath. Somewhere near the back, a reporter's pen was moving very fast across a notepad. Denise Cole left through a side door before the dessert course was served. She did not know yet, as she walked out into the September night, that her sister had been arrested in April. She did not know that the evidence against Vanessa would be presented in open court in 3 weeks. She did not know that the connection between Sentinel Coastal's claims division and a Portland poisoning case was about to become the story that reporters across the country would chase for the next 6 months. She found all of it out the same way the rest of the world did. In the morning papers, in the press release, in the courtroom transcripts that became public record one by one like doors swinging open onto rooms full of light. Elena drove home that night with Richard in the back of a car moving quietly through Boston's lit streets and said almost nothing. Richard said she had done well. She looked out the window at the city, her grandfather's city, her mother's city, hers now, and thought about a woman in a foster home in Eugene who had believed her whole life that she came from nothing. She thought about what it means to be told you are nobody, and to build a life anyway, and to find out one day that the nobody you were told you were had a name and a history, and a mother who painted watercolors, and a grandfather who never stopped looking. She thought that the gala had not been revenge. It had been a reckoning. There is a difference, and the difference matters. The trial began in October as scheduled, and it was not the dramatic television courtroom event that people who have never sat through a real criminal trial might imagine. It was procedural and exhausting and meticulous and slow. Elena did not attend every day. She had a life to rebuild, and she chose to spend those days building it rather than sitting in a room watching a man she had once loved try to explain himself to a jury of strangers. Her criminal attorney, the one she had hired not for herself, but for strategy, as she had told Richard that first week at the rehabilitation facility, worked closely with the prosecution, and the evidence was, by any measure, overwhelming. The credit card receipts for the oleander, the search history on the laptop, the text messages between Marcus and Vanessa, the toxicology panel that named the compound, and the timeline. The medical testimony about what repeated oleandrin exposure does to a human heart over the course of 6 months. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Marcus Calloway was convicted in November of attempted murder in the first degree and sentenced to 24 years in the Oregon State Penitentiary. Vanessa Cole was convicted in January of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 15 years. Denise Cole was indicted separately in March, not only for her role in canceling Elena's insurance policy, but for insurance fraud and obstruction connected to 3 other policy terminations that had conveniently preceded patient deaths at county care facilities over the previous 4 years. Those earlier cases had gone unnoticed, buried in the paperwork of overworked hospitals and underfunded wards, exactly the way Marcus had planned for Elena's case to go unnoticed. The investigation into Denise and what she had built inside Sentinel Coastal's claims division was still ongoing. The number of people who had been harmed was still being counted. Elena did not attend Marcus's sentencing. She thought about it for a long time, sat with it, turned it over, tried to understand what she would actually want from being in that room, what it would give her that she did not already have. In the end, she decided that she had already said everything that needed to be said, and that the most powerful thing she could do was not be there. She sent Richard in her place with a single folded sheet of paper in his jacket pocket, a letter from her that the judge read aloud into the record. She will not share all of it here. But the closing line was this: I was a woman you married for what you thought you could take from her. You took from me my trust, my health, and almost my life. You did not take from me the capacity to build something better without you. That was not yours to take. The morning the letter was read into the record, Elena stood on the balcony of the Ashford townhouse on Commonwealth Avenue and watched the first snow of the season drift down onto the brownstones below. She was wearing a black cashmere coat. She was holding a cup of coffee, not tea, not yet, maybe not ever again, and she had decided she was allowed to feel that way for as long as she needed to. Richard was waiting downstairs with the car. They were going to Massachusetts General to break ground on the new wing. She thought about the woman she had been 6 weeks before all of this began. The art teacher with the rust-spotted Subaru. The woman who had believed the warm mug pressed into her hands each night was an act of love, who had trusted so completely and so fully that the betrayal of it had required 6 months of poison to accomplish. She did not think that woman had been stupid. She thought she had been trusting. There is a difference, and the difference matters more than almost anything else she had learned in the long, strange year behind her. She thought about all the other women whose stories had ended where hers almost did, in a county ward, quietly, without anyone to ask the right questions or order the right tests or settle the bill before the transfer paperwork went through. Women whose hearts had been poisoned slowly by people who claimed to love them. Women who had never had a Richard Holt knock twice on a door frame, whose grandfathers had not served on hospital boards, whose trusts had not been waiting for them. Women whose lives had depended on whether a wealthy stranger happened to be looking for them, and for whom no wealthy stranger had come. She thought about them not with guilt. She had not chosen her grandfather's estate any more than she had chosen the foster system, but with something that had no clean name, a kind of clarity that comes from having nearly died and having chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge of the alternative, to live. She thought about what her mother would have wanted. A pediatric nurse who spent her career making sure children's hearts kept beating. A woman who had painted watercolors and laughed into cameras and died too young on a New Hampshire roadside before she ever got to watch her daughter grow up. Elena thought she knew the answer. She had known it, really, since that first week on the porch swing with the plain hot water and the folder with Marcus's name on it, known what she was going to do with what she had been given, known that the inheritance was not the money and it was not the townhouse, and it was not the 47 company stakes or the majority share of an insurance conglomerate. The inheritance was this: the chance to make sure that what had almost happened to her could not simply happen, quietly and unremarked, to someone else. The new wing at Massachusetts General would carry her mother's name. Its protocols would require toxicology screening for any cardiac patient whose deterioration pattern matched unexplained long-term exposure. Its financial assistance program would ensure that no patient could be transferred out of critical care due to an insurance cancellation while under active treatment. It would not fix everything. She knew that. But it would fix something, and something was where you started, and starting was what you did when you were 31 years old and alive and stubborn and finally, fully, undeniably yourself. She heard the car horn below, Richard, patient as always but with a schedule to keep. She took one more sip of coffee. She watched the snow settle on the brownstones, quiet and unhurried, covering the old city in something clean and white and new. Then she turned from the railing, walked back through the glass door into the warmth of her grandfather's house, picked up her coat, and went downstairs to build something.